what I want to do tonight has three different sections. Okay. In the first section, I want to speak a little bit about the secular, about what constitutes the secular, and identify a couple of key moments in the foundation of the secular. And that phrase, the foundation of the secular, hopefully is a hint as to where I'm going. Then in my second section, I want to speak a little bit about how a focus on language might slightly blur these lines between the secular realm and the faith-centered realm. These lines aren't as clearly defined as we might often assume. And then I want to conclude with some pointers towards the future. Now, as I've already mentioned, the idea that the secular has been founded is something that not everyone takes for granted. In fact, I often took quite the opposite for granted, that the secular was always with us. And then in the mid-90s, I remember reading a book by a guy called John Milbank called Theology and Social Theory. And the first line of Milbank's book is striking. It says, "Once there was no secular, full stop." It's a remarkable idea. For Milbank, the secular has to be invented. It has to come about. It was a long and arduous process which gave us this thing called the secular. Milbank argues, and I think quite coherently, that the secular wasn't even thinkable for thousands of years. We couldn't even imagine the secular. So the secular has a history. It comes into being in time, and this is a long, rumbling, burgeoning development. It perhaps has its origins in the high medieval period, with Duns Scotus, with the notions of the univocity of being, perhaps grounded in Aquinas. But tonight I'd like to speak a little bit about Immanuel Kant, and a little bit about Kant's famous essay from 1784 called What is Enlightenment? Many of you might be familiar with this essay, What is Enlightenment? In it, Kant speaks about this thing called the public realm, this space, this faith-free zone, where people will think rationally. He contrasts this with people being what he calls under minority. For example, people being in the tutelage of a church, or people being enslaved to a sacred book. These people, for Kant, cannot be free. They're in servitude. And for Kant, they need to leave these things at the door if they're going to come in and participate freely in the public realm. Here we have a pure notion, a pure account of the secular as a faith-free realm. Now, Kant's essay, What is Enlightenment, is unthinkable without his prior work on pure reason. In 1781, he writes his famous critique of pure reason. And I want to speak a little bit about the notion of reason upon which this model of the secular is based. Because I want to argue that if this model of reason is untenable, and I think it is, then the whole notion of the secular as a faith-free realm might be untenable too. Kant begins famously, and any philosophy students here will know the expression, Hume woke me from my dogmatic slumber. I've often taught courses on Kant, and students have remembered nothing about Kant's philosophy, apart from that one phrase, Hume woke me from my dogmatic slumber. And what Kant means by that is he's reacting against the empiricists. He's reacting against Locke's tabula rasa, the idea that everything we know is simply impressions made on the blank slate of our mind by sensory data. And this is a bit scary for Kant. It's a bit scary because everyone's sensory data is going to be different. And so if what we call knowledge is purely the result of our own experience, we have relativism. Everybody thinks differently. Everybody has different contexts. How can we speak about reason if it means different things to everybody? And so in response to this, Kant says that yes, all our knowledge is based upon sensory data. It is based upon sensory experience. But it doesn't simply make marks on a blank slate in our mind. It's actually filtered. It's filtered through categories in our mind which every single human being has. Now, the importance of this cannot be overestimated. Because the idea that there's a thing called the human, upon which notions like human rights get based, isn't self-evident. There isn't a clear and coherent notion of the human. Kant helps form that by speaking about these categories that every single human being have. These categories like space, time, and language. And so sensory data, like my peripheral vision here, all of your faces, that's coming to my mind, and it's not going in unedited, it's being filtered by categories that are already there. Categories like space, like time, and like language. It's a very difficult task to explain Kant's categories, but think, for example, in terms of space. Think about the universe. The universe is expanding outwards, like a big balloon that's blowing up. Think about that edge, that line, and think about what's on the far side of that line. We can't think about it. We've no categories because it's non-space. It's the other of space. We just can't think about it. Similarly, language. Can we think about something we don't have a word for? We try and go, but if there's no word, nothing comes. And crucially, all these categories which filter data upon which we can think rationally, the notion of God is by definition outside of these categories. Think of a triangle with space, time, and language. God by definition is outside of space, outside of time, outside of language. Therefore, there's no place for God in this Kantian universe. This is the universe in which we can do reason, in which we can do rational thought. And God by definition is outside of this. And so Kant's naked public sphere, Kant's public realm from what is enlightenment, is utterly predicated upon this notion of reason. This notion of reason wherein the notion of God must be by definition irrational. And for Kant, it's fine to do all this God stuff. You can do it at home, behind closed doors, where you won't scare the horses. But you don't do it out in the public realm, because this is the realm of reason, the realm of rationality. And so Kant begins to think about this two-world theory. And so much of modernity, so much of our contemporary framework is based upon these oppositions. Again, oppositions we take for granted between public and private. I've got my public reason, and then I'll go home and subversively do religion. Between reason, a good thing that we do in the public realm, and then faith, this voodoo-like thing that we don't do. And so Kant helps establish this notion, the secular, this faith-free zone. But I want to suggest that it doesn't really work like this. Kant's famous book, The Critique of Pure Reason, well, it's a bit like Oscar Wilde. Oscar Wilde says the truth is rarely pure and never simple. Well, reason, contra Kant, isn't pure either, because there is no naked space. Language sullies it, because language is the building blocks of reason. Language is the process through which we do abstract reasoning. And for every word we use, for every signifier, every word, there's a signified in our heads, but these words are all different. Or these signifieds are all different. For example, let's say I use the signifier CAT, cat. And I said, there's a cat running down those steps. Well, we would all have a little signified in our head of a wee little tabby cat running down the steps. And we'd probably look around expecting to go, oh, isn't that lovely? Now, if we were at a zoo and I said there's a big cat running down those steps, we'd have a very different reaction. And for example, if I was in Harlem in the 1970s and I said there's a cat running down those steps, I might mean something entirely different again. And so the nightmare scenario that Kant is trying to avoid by speaking about pure reason, in saying that reason is based upon the building blocks of language, starts to seep in. This was made very evident for me about 3 years ago at a presentation I was at Cambridge, where Tony Blair got all these religious studies and scholars and theologians into a room. And he was trying to sell the idea that freedom is a vital notion for theology and religion. He was ultimately trying to get us on board in terms of his foreign policy. And he was saying that religions are invested in freedom because the notion of freedom ultimately stems from religious concepts. And he didn't do very well. He was absolutely battered by an Islamic scholar who was there. And she was dressed head to toe in the burqa. And she said, Mr. Blair, why do you think that what you mean by freedom is the same as what I mean by freedom? By wearing these clothes, I can be free. A member of your cabinet has only in the past 2 weeks had plastic surgery. She has paid someone to take a scalpel to her flesh and cut her in order to look a certain way for society. She says, by being enslaved to Allah, I can have freedom. I can have freedom from my own drives, which might lead me in an erroneous direction. I'll be enslaved by cultural pressure, by social demands, but here I can be free. Of course, her notion of freedom wasn't all that different from the kind of Christian notion of freedom we have with Augustine. The point is that to assume that freedom means the same thing for different people is absurd. And in our societies, in our public realms, we want freedom. We move towards freedom. But no matter how secular we are, no matter how atheistic we are, we have a certain belief about what constitutes freedom. This is a belief that's been given to us by our culture, by our context, by our perspective. She had one. Tony Blair had a different one. His position that he was trying to advance was a secular position. But it was belief-laden. It was faith-centered. He had faith that there is such a thing called freedom, and that this is what freedom means. Hers was more explicitly religious, but she too had a clear notion of what freedom was. Neither the public nor the private, neither the rational nor the faith-centered, neither the secular nor the religious had a faith-free realm from which to work. Let me give one more example of this, because it's not just based upon words. Our basic sensory data, the way we perceive the world, is predicated upon our traditions. It's predicated upon our context. It's predicated ultimately upon our beliefs, which we soak in through memes, in a sense. Memes are a very hotly contested notion. They're analogous to genes, but whereas a gene is passed on in a vertical fashion, memes are passed on horizontally, like a virus, like a sneeze or something like that. What's an example of a meme? School ground crazes are memes. You know the way in the schoolyard, all of a sudden everyone starts with the yo-yos, or at some other time of year everyone starts wearing, think about wearing your baseball cap back to front. That was something that some kid did somewhere, probably in the United States, and it spreads like a virus. And all of a sudden, everyone starts wearing their baseball caps back to front. Well, humans have evolved to be perfect receptors of these memes. And memes help us explain why, for example, children from one part of Belfast, in Ireland, where I come from, think a certain way, and children from a different part of Belfast think in a very, very different way. In Catholic West Belfast, there are very few Lutherans. Kids don't grow up wanting to be Lutherans. It tends not to happen, by and large. Now, of course, any decent evolving being would be pre-programmed to soak up affirming ideas from their environment. Now, I worked in Belfast for a while in one summer from college, and we were trying to help teenagers who had been arrested on what they considered to be small charges, like blowing up cars and things like that, which in Belfast are very minor offences by and large. And we did a very, very interesting experiment. It wasn't considered an experiment, it was considered therapy, but for me, it was an experiment by and large. And what we did was, we showed them a parade, because in Northern Ireland, parades are absolutely essential. We have a St. Patrick's Day parade, where the green side come out and are all very happy, and then we have a July the 12th parade, where the orange side come out and are very happy. And we showed them pictures of these parades. And we asked them to describe what they saw, and by and large, the Protestant children were saying, well, this St. Patrick's Day parade, their faces are twisted and contorted with rage, with hostility, with anger. And then we got the Catholic kids that look at the same thing. They said, these are joyous faces, these are happy faces. But the faces in the orange parade, they are triumphalist, they're aggressive, they're violent, and they're threatening. And what the kids didn't realize was that we used the same faces. We just photoshopped them into the different parades. And so the colors, the backgrounds, the context absolutely determined their basic reflexive response to what they were seeing. It wasn't naked. It was context-laden. It was belief-driven. It was faith-centered. The ideas that we hold dear in our society are not ideas that, by and large, can be rationally illustrated to all right-thinking people. Think about racial equality. Belief in racial equality is something that I hold very, very dear. All people don't hold it. I can't prove it to someone. I can't use a rational argument to make it evident. But it's a belief that we should have freedom, that we should redistribute wealth in order to make everyone not starve, is something that is a faith. Whether Karl Marx holds it, or whether I hold it based upon gospel values. ultimately the goods, the ends that our society moves towards, are beliefs that cannot be evacuated from positions that we accept on faith, such as faith in the fact that slavery is wrong, faith in the fact that races are created equal or are equal. These are beliefs that we move towards. Kant argues for most of his life against teleological rationality in ethical thinking. What does he mean by teleological rationality? He means the idea that we call something good or bad based upon the question, what is it for? Let's say, for example, take a knife, for example. If we're to say this is a good knife, we mean that it cuts stuff well. So we say a knife is for cutting stuff, and this is a good knife because it cuts stuff. And so these end-directed questions, where we are going, ultimately determines, for example, Thomistic and Aristotelian rationalities in terms of ethical thinking. And so we posit our society is moving towards greater equality, or our society is moving towards bread for all. Peace, land and bread is what Lenin promises. These are ends which he considers good. He can't prove that they're good intrinsically, but he believes that they're good. We hold these truths to be self-evident, is an Enlightenment premise which grounds things like the American Constitution. That's ridiculously faith-based. We hold these truths to be self-evident. And so, what I'm suggesting is not that our question should be, what role should belief have? I'm suggesting that we face up to the fact that belief has a huge role. Whether we're Islamic, Christian, Hindu, Buddhist, atheistic, we have beliefs. We have basic conditioned contextual responses. How we process information is tradition-based, based upon our experience, based upon our culture. We can't have a faith-free realm. It doesn't exist. Blair's notion, which was based upon his secular idea of what freedom was just as faith-based as the Islamic scholars was. Now I want to make a suggestion which is a bit risky. Let's say we entertain the notion. Some of you here might buy the idea that there's no such thing as a faith-free realm. Many might not. But let's entertain it for a second. What if the secular is itself as a conceptual framework which has faiths and which has beliefs? What if that were the case? Then, if that is the case, then it alone is a totalitarian religious worldview which seeks to annihilate all other religious perspectives and deny them a place in the public realm. Whereas Christian perspectives and Islamic perspectives can come together in the marketplace of ideas by and large, and we have historical examples of it, and hopefully we would, certainly all the main churches and religious leaders would articulate the possibility of this. The secular is predicated upon the notion that alternative religious perspectives must be silenced, must be annihilated. Now, I'm not saying that all secular thinkers are like this, and most, pardon the pun, enlightened secular thinkers are certainly not like this. But they will nonetheless say that there's a thing called reason, and people in explicit religious traditions aren't playing this game. And if they don't play this game, then we can negate their ideas. We can laugh at them, we can ridicule them, or push them off the table. But think of it. If the secular is a religion in disguise, to quote John Milbank, then what kind of a religion is it? Is it a religion that can allow for pluralism? Or is it a religion that implicitly seeks to annihilate alternative perspectives in the public realm? So, I just want to conclude my paper by saying that if we can be more open about this fact, and again, I use the word, Alistair McIntyre says facts like telescopes and wigs for gentlemen are a 17th century invention. If we can be more open about this idea that we are all context-driven, we are all tradition-specific, then we might begin to realize our own embeddedness within a perspective. We might begin to open up to the possibility of dialogue where our goal is not necessarily agreement, where our goal is not necessarily to find that neutral space or to find the rational truth. But we can dialogue with the goal of cross-pollinating each other's worldviews. Because words don't stay static. After that conversation, what that signifier freedom connoted for Blair had evolved. Think of the signifier David. My parents used the exact same word to refer to me as they did 34 years ago. But what that signifier signifies has changed and evolved. Every time we dialogue, like here, every time we enter into discourse, this kind of cross-pollination takes place. When we start to stop using the same word to mean a certain thing, it evolves, it grows, it develops. And so rather than the Enlightenment goal of coming together to find the rational truth or to do reason in a certain way which can find the answers, we realize that we are all bound in certain traditions and certain perspectives. And we come together not to find agreement, but to cross-pollinate, but to share resources and perspectives which can be mutually enlightening.
But I just like to throw in my 5 cents on that with a special reference to the issue of hijab, which I consider a non-issue that has become overblown in the media internationally, actually, in several countries. You're all familiar with what's going on. But just to have a few comments on the question of secular that David spoke about. In my humble mind, I'm not a philosopher, I have a distinction in my mind between secularity and secularism. And I have a distinction between secularism and secular fundamentalism, which becomes so intolerant in its conviction of its own brand of secularism that nobody else has the right to practice other than what they dictate. And you know what I mean. For example, an MP, a female MP, was elected in Turkey to the parliament, and the Speaker of the House refused to let her take the oath of office until she removes her hijab, which she considered to be religiously mandated. And the most dangerous is secular fundamentalism. We see it in some countries, including some Muslim countries. Secondly, the question of public space and the Kant's opinion on that. Well, can we think of perhaps a faith neutral rather than faith free? In my understanding, everybody has some faith. Even an atheist has faith in something. I mean, if you define faith perhaps more broadly. So the issue here is whether we can have faith neutral without infringing on others, where, as David says, people can practice what they are convinced of, what they perceive to be good for them, rather than suppressing their rights. The point that David raised about the lady debating with Mr. Blair, I just like to affirm that by saying that I heard that from a lot of Muslim ladies in my travels throughout the world. 35 countries I visited. And invariably, a lot of them simply say that why do some people look to us in a condescending way? Why do they think that if we were... That's not me, by the way.
It was me.
Okay. Why do they think that if we wear hijab, there must be some male chauvinist who forced us to do this? One time, my wife and I were attending a function, an interfaith function, right here in Halifax. We were like a few couples sitting at the same table. And that, again, reflects the thinking of a lot of people. And here a little old lady looks at my wife with pity because she has her hijab. And she says, Mrs. Badawi, if Dr. Badawi said you can take off your hijab, what would you do? And my wife snaps back, I divorce him. I'm not doing that for him. Actually, my wife, when she came to North America, she did not observe hijab. She decided to do that here. Sometimes they say it is because they come from certain culture that are so rigid. What explains the fact that a lot of ladies who are reversed to Islam in the West, like that British journalist Yvonne Ridley, begin to observe hijab in a society that find that very strange. In France, sometimes they consider it a political statement. And here again, there is a distinction, in my mind at least, between just freedom or expression of faith and practice of faith. For a Muslim woman wearing hijab, they say, all right, you can wear it in your own home, in your privacy, but not in public. But actually, for a Muslim lady, that's her religiously mandated thing, especially in the public. Actually, at home, she's not required to observe. So sometimes we try to reverse even and project our understanding of what public sphere or public space might be. Then another issue, perhaps, that was not directly raised by David, even though it's implied in what he's talked about, the question of culture. And let's be frank on it. Of course, you heard about that village in Quebec where they say, if you come here, there's no this, there's no that, and everybody's saying you must respect culture. Now, my question here is this. Who defines culture and cultural practices? If a Muslim is living in Britain, does it mean that he has to go for a couple of beers after work, eat fish and chips, and watch rugby? Not every Britisher even is doing that. How about curry? That became a national dish, even though it is originally Indian. Who defines what is a culture? But suppose even you have a predominant culture. Why should the dominant culture act in a sort of what I call chauvinistic cultural practices toward others who may not necessarily share? They have to be at least a basic denominator that everybody accepts as reasonable. But we cannot really say that you must fall in line because the majority say so. It's a bit condescending as well. Every human being has the right to be different, so long as you're not infringing on others. Then there's issue of human rights. And sometimes we seem to reverse the argument, or logic in my mind. That people say, no, we have to liberate those Muslim ladies from that oppressive hijab, which, like I said, many ladies said, it liberates us. It liberates us. We're free from the pressure of designers and fashions. And if I'm serving God, it's in my belief I'm doing that to please God, male or female. I don't care what other people say. To me, it is liberating. To others, it is imprisonment. I have to get them out of that prison. But why can't also we say that in the name of human rights, we argue for oppression of other people in the name of human rights without realizing that religious practice and expression, for that matter, that does not infringe on others, is one of the highest forms of human rights that should be respected. So sometimes we're juggling things and, ignoring or trying to define human rights in our particular way. In conclusion, I'd just like to commend David for his excellent presentation, and I fully share with him his conclusion that can we agree on a basic thing, basic denominator? Can we agree at least as a bottom line that you should not violate the law in the name of religion? Can we agree that we should be sensible also that my religious practice does not give me the right to use the drums all night while you're asleep in a residential area? Some of the decent practices that we should engage in towards each other, but in the meantime enjoy the richness of diversity, and instead of looking down on others or in a condescending manner that my culture is superior, everybody should follow me, rather look at it humbly with the view of learning from each other, enriching each other. And thank you.
Thank you. I didn't see the sort of secularism I advocate in anything David said. I think we have very different ideas. But some points. One, of course, people should be free to express their religious beliefs and to participate in public life on the basis of their religious beliefs. If there are any impediments to their expressing themselves, let us work to remove them. Do religious people, in fact, find it hard to express their beliefs or to perform their rituals in public? Are the barriers they encounter any other than those of their own embarrassment or their sense that they risk being mocked? Well, we should not mock people, at least not habitually, but we ought not to be restricted from mocking people. That would be to deny people the freedom to express themselves. 2, currently, calls to censor, suppress, and punish expression often come from religious people. Some religious people would like to be legally or quasi-legally exempt from criticism or mockery. But it's not only some religious people who would like us to be like us to be less free to express ourselves. There continues in our society to be a general deference to religion and to religious sensibilities. Part of the task of creating a secular society is to insist that while a person's religious beliefs and practices are important to that person, they are of no more importance socially, legally, or politically than anything else that matters to people. That a belief is a religious belief or that a practice is a religious practice does not give it any particular authority. 3, religious influence in the public sphere is of two sorts. On the one hand, we find that some offices outside religious organizations are still controlled by religious groups. For instance, here at St. Mary's, 6 members of our Board of Governors are appointed by organizations within the Catholic Church, and the Archbishop of Halifax has an official role as an advisor. This influence is unfortunate and harmful. We secularists have a lot of work to continue to do. Point 4. On the other hand, we find people appealing to their religious beliefs and texts and traditions when discussing the social and political issues of the day and advocating certain policies or programs on the basis of their fit with these beliefs, texts, and traditions. That's all fine and well, of course, and I defend their ability to do so. There ought to be no impediments to their doing so. We should listen to them politely, though we might have to struggle to do so, but eventually we'll have to draw them back to the topic at hand. That a policy or program has religious backing is entirely irrelevant to whether it is a sound or desirable policy or program. That God disapproves of Xing, whatever Xing is no reason not to X. What we need to know is why God disapproves of Xing. Once we have some understanding of that, we can evaluate these reasons to see whether they are indeed good reasons for our disapproving of Xing. 5. Our project of creating a secular society has 2 aspects then. The first is to abolish religious privilege in the public sphere. The second is to point out to religious people the irrelevance to public discussion of the religious bases of their social criticism and advocacy. Secularism doesn't demand anything of religious people, not even that they keep their beliefs and practices at home, but it does make the point that if they are going to propose a policy or a program, that they attempt to justify it in ways that others of us can understand. We atheists would like that religion disappear. We want it to disappear, though, either through people's abandoning their religious beliefs as false and silly, or through people's growing indifferent to religion as they find other projects and pursuits through which to live happily. In working toward a secular society, we might well create conditions under which religion becomes less and less a part of people's lives. And that's terrific. But the project of creating a secular society and the project of disabusing people of their religious beliefs are 2 separate projects. The secular society we wish to create is not one in which people are unable to use public spaces or public money to worship or to express their beliefs. But it is one in which public spaces and public money are allotted fairly. And that means that public officials do not count religious purposes as more deserving than any other purposes, nor do they take religious objections to other people seriously. 7. Strong advocate of freedom of expression though I am, I don't trust freedom of expression. Maybe that's just because I don't know what we're supposed or not supposed to trust it to do. Freedom of expression can help to promote a better society, mainly because candor in public discussion can help us to identify problems and to seek solutions. But this sword has 2 edges. I love freedom of expression just because I like that we, both you and I, can say what we want, how we want. Certainly as well, we are not respectful of the autonomy of others if we are prepared to silence them. Now, not everyone who values social equality, prosperity, and the means by which people can live lives they find meaningful also values expression or respect. So, to those who are left cold by the main reasons for which I favor wide freedom of expression, I would point out that the alternative to freedom is dreadful, even from their own perspective. The alternative, we know, is authoritarianism and all its ills, including these days identity politics and the cult of victimization. In my optimistic moods, I think that those who act against freedom just don't realize what evil they are fostering. In my pessimistic moods, though, it occurs to me that these people are fully aware of what they are doing. Thank you.